We're happy to be joined by Camila Escalante, correspondent with Telesur in Bolivia, reporting from the ground right now. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me and for covering this important election.
For sure. Now, you've been in Bolivia for the past few weeks, traveling around the country, reporting on the lead up to the elections, of course, highly anticipated. Could MAS, the party of Evo Morales, actually win and return to power just a year after the coup?
They absolutely believe that they're going to win, that they have the votes and the support to win. Of course, last year in the October 2019 election that took place on October 20th, that was a Sunday, so it'll be exactly a year from now. They won. The candidate Evo Morales, who was running for re-election, won with 47% of the vote. So that was with a lot of, a bit of a decline in support from his previous elections where he won majorities. And so they do believe that they're going to be receiving at least 50%. And that's, of course, the polls are not always accurate. They're not always representing the rural areas. They're not representing the exterior vote, which is always pro-MAS, and a lot of other factors. So they do believe that they will be receiving undoubtedly between 45% to even over 50% of the vote, and that they should be winning within the first round.
You interviewed Luis Arce, the MAS presidential candidate currently polling in first place. What were your big takeaways from that interview? Do you think he's cut from the same cloth as Evo Morales? And what are Luis's priorities? And why do you think he's so popular among the MAS base?
Well, he's popular because of his record as Minister of Economy for Evo Morales. And people say that he's a very technical guy. He's a very organized person. They are not the same candidate. They're not the same type of leader. They're two different people. And Luis Arce has never been in the limelight. He kind of did his job and did his work. And through his works, Bolivia was able to, improve the situation. So, I think that people have grown to know him a lot better, and he's a very likable guy. He's taken to these different events, and he's just kind of flourished in the spotlight. And he's been doing media every single day. The day that I interviewed him, he was just doing a lineup of national media that morning. And I think that he's really learned how to connect with the people, and for that reason, they believe that they're going to be able to bring back some of the voters who might not have been so enchanted with the MAS or may have been turned away because of the propaganda war against the movement towards socialism and Evo Morales that has taken place around the last year.
A key factor in last year's coup was this issue of counting ballots from the more rural indigenous majority areas that are MAS strongholds. So do you believe this could be another issue? And what do you anticipate about claims of fraud?
That is another issue because when the votes begin coming in, the first votes that we receive might be from the cities. That will be the case again this time around. And they were just talking about that right now, that it's really important that the political parties do not begin to celebrate a win when only something like 5% of the votes have been accounted for. It's very important that the media and the different parties involved don't celebrate when we don't have the complete picture. It'll take several days to get the final count, and the rural those areas of the country which are traditionally supporting the MAS, they will continue to support the MAS this time around. Those votes will be coming in later, and we need to know the final count. There's a lot at stake here, and there's a potential for things to really flare up. So it's important that everybody take their time, see what the count is, and wait for the official announcements by the TSE.
Luis Arce also received a late endorsement from Felipe Quispe, longtime indigenous leader and a longtime critic of the MAS. Does this represent a broader trend? It seems Arce is receiving support from areas that are not known to be MAS party strongholds.
Yes, they are receiving receiving support from a lot of different people who had some criticisms of the government of Evo Morales. Of course, some of those criticisms were largely things that they worked through. Of course, Evo Morales had a really important working relationship with different sectors that were not necessarily pro-MAS per se, but they found ways of working through that. And so some of the groups are, indigenous groups and different parts of the country. They're not just supporting Arce; they're supporting an entire movement and an entire, these bases throughout Bolivia, which there are social movements, there are women's and indigenous and unions that all account for this movement party. And also David Choquehuanca, the vice presidential candidate for the MAS, is a very popular person as well who has his own support base.
A MAS victory would be an amazing turnaround for the Bolivian left, as well as a major gain for the Latin American left as a whole. What would a MAS victory mean for the future of Bolivia, and what would its geopolitical implications be?
Well, I think that a MAS victory will be challenged. It will be challenged because they are looking as if they're going to win in the first round, as the campaign believes. But I think there are going to be a lot of issues along the way when they retake power, because obviously it was taken so quickly in that coup. But I think, Evo Morales had a very good relationship with a lot of his neighbors, both neighbors who were governed by socialist governments and ones that are not. And Luis Arce has already stepped up and has met with Alberto Fernandez in Argentina just within the last few days. And, he's ready to build relationships with neighboring countries, no matter, what the positions of their governments are. But there will obviously be very important ties to Mexico and Argentina and some other countries that this regime stepped in and broke ties with. So that includes Nicaragua, Venezuela. Of course, the regime here yesterday, with 3 days until the election, they recognized by receiving the credentials of Juan Guaido's ambassador. So this is, of course, a fake ambassador. And so that's the type of policy that they're trying to just cram in a couple days before the election. The reverse will happen once the movement towards socialism takes power, but that would be in December. So the election is now, and then the handing over of power wouldn't happen for several weeks. So there's a lot of potential for things to change during that time.
The last year has brought in an unfettered string of violence by Bolivia's right-wing groups against MAS leaders and supporters, indigenous communities, and organized labor. Now, Casachun News called these committee cívicos foot soldiers of the coup. Can you describe their role over the last year, and what role do you think they might play on election day and following?
Absolutely. Well, we did see some violence last week. There was one day where there were 3 incidences that took place all at the same time in the departments of Santa Cruz and Cochabamba. Some people have said that they are surprised that they have seemed a little bit quiet in some parts of the country. But I do think that there's a lot building up, a lot of, apprehension about this election. And I think that it takes, very little for things to flare up. And Fernando Camacho is a very long shot candidate, but he was one of the most prominent, important leaders of the coup. And also, he was able to rile up a lot of these different sectors and these far right wing groups. And so that's something that could happen again. And Fernando Camacho might not necessarily be the leader this time around. There's a lot of other personalities that have arisen who have called for violence, and they have really tried to paint the movement towards socialism as barbaric, as slanderous things towards indigenous people, tried to associate the party, of course, with drug dealing and different things which are completely baseless. And so they are trying to garner support within their own communities. But the reality is they do represent a very small minority within the country. And so if there were to be some sort of conflict, let's say, they would be severely outnumbered, except in very limited parts of the country.
A U.S.-backed NGO, Rios de Pie, called you part of an international conspiracy against the Áñez regime. What do you make from these accusations against you and other journalists who have received threats from the right wing and U.S.-backed organizations?
Well, the specific thing they were referring to was a SALAG poll that I tweeted. And if you look at the SALAG poll and you look at all the other polling data that came out around that time, it's basically exactly the same. The only difference was that SALAG was representing, in that specific graphic that I showed, it was representing valid votes, and a lot of the other media is representing the numbers with the null, blank, and discarded, or people who didn't answer that specific polling response to the pollsters. So the information that I was representing as a journalist was no different from what any other network pollster has been putting out, and so I just think it's a very bad example on their part. But they have also been, I know that they're keeping track of journalists. They do say that this is, they said it, I mean, obviously it's a little bit of an anti-communist thing as well, right? But I've been covering Bolivia for a very long time, and so have other people in Europe. There's a very well-known person here in Bolivia, well known by people in Bolivia and followed by people in Latin America, who's in Spain. His name is Alejandro Antrabasaguas, and he is in all of the right-wing media here, and he's writing and producing slanderous reports against the MAS. What kind of role does this person play? This person is in Spain. He's been in Bolivia for, I don't know, he came here maybe for a couple of days. I've had a very strong presence here in the country and have been covering Bolivia around the clock for years on the platforms that I have available to me, and very consistently trying to report from from a very profound perspective. And I don't see any criticisms from the people who are intervening with this process from places like Miami, and that includes some of the CNN anchors, one of which specifically, CNN Espanol, has come here and supported and shook hands with Camacho. That same person now, that same news anchor from CNN Espanol, is now reaching out to Camacho and telling him to withdraw from the campaign and support Carlos Mesa. I don't know in what world is it seen that my coverage is propaganda, but that someone else can give directives as a journalist to an actual political figure within the country.
One final question, Camila. An important political issue that could be impacted in this election is that of women's rights. We've seen a startling increase in the number of femicides and instances of domestic violence across Latin America. Bolivians recently celebrated their Women's Day on October 11th. Can you discuss what the last year under the coup government has looked like for working, poor, and indigenous women across Bolivia? And what is the MAS Party's record and program on women's issues?
Yeah, this has been a particularly difficult time. A lot of the way in which this economy of Bolivia is organized is that a lot of people are merchants. They go out and they sell things every day. They need to do work in person. People don't have the luxury of sitting at home like people in the global north, specifically in places like London, Toronto, and New York, and sitting on their computer and doing work, meeting on Skype or anything like that. People need to go outside, and the economy needs to be activated, and they need some support from the state, and that's something that the process of change here in Bolivia was some sort of a revolution which allowed people which incorporated women and indigenous people, and of course brought people into the government through the structure of the MAS Party. And I think that's something that right now Bolivia has to decide whether to reverse that or not. But Luis Arce met with the Bartolina Cisas, which is, of course, the important Confederation of Women, Indigenous Women of Bolivia, who are very influential. And they asked him that he advance their agenda during his mandate when he becomes president. And I can't see anything, there's no sort of other base below supporting these other candidates that they are not tied to any actual social movements. Of course, these people have support from fake NGO, NED and USAID-backed groups, and these are just individuals who travel to Washington or the UN to speak to, who knows who. But as far as who actually has connections to women here on the ground and who understands the necessities of women here in Bolivia. That's only one party.